Great. Good morning, everyone. Sorry I couldn't join yesterday. Teaching responsibilities, and my younger son had his birthday, so it'd be improper for me to leave. I did catch, I would say, a quarter of yesterday's deliberations through the online system, so I'm able to sort of reflect upon what was discussed yesterday. And also, thank you for giving me the time to reflect. I spent the last few weeks reflecting upon sort of my evolving thoughts of my research area. And really what I'm trying to do here is to get you to think about your thoughts on your research area. So as I speak about my interests, I want you to sort of start glossing over and think about how you do this work. How do you connect and collaborate? How do you draw in methods and ways of thinking from different disciplines? How do you actually go from research to action, and how do you go from sort of just knowing something to doing something? So my monitor is moving, but not the screen. Okay, let's try this again. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to talk about ASGM, which is artisanal and small-scale gold mining. It's sort of a case study. It's largely situated in low and middle-income countries. It's been practiced for centuries, and it's now believed to be the world's largest source of mercury pollution. So my story begins in West Africa, in the Gold Coast of Africa, in northern Ghana, a rather desolate and pastoral region that hasn't really changed much for centuries, really shaped by trade routes. But as with any place in the world, it's starting to experience rapid global change. So there are a number of ASGM sites in Ghana, and this particular one is called Kajetia, and there's a manager of the site. His name is Charles, and below his feet is barren rock and soil, but within that rock, it's gold. There's gold. So you have these communities that are really impoverished and poor, and lying below their feet is gold. So the goal is to sort of pull the gold out. And this is backbreaking, physically taxing, difficult work, but people do it. Here you have an individual appearing from a mine shaft. And once that ore containing the gold has been pulled out, I mean, these sacks of rock, they're 100 pounds, and people are moving them day in, day out. So physically taxing work. Once the ore has been brought to the surface, you want to sort of get the gold out of the ore. So you grind it up, and you grind and you grind and you grind, and then eventually you start to sort of sieve it, and then you start washing that ground powder, because what you're trying to do is to liberate the gold out from the ore. You get concentrated gold, but you really want to start seeing gold in that form that we're used to, in a gold bar. So the way to do it is to use mercury. Mercury has a very high affinity for gold. That's what's in that little bottle there. So what the gentleman here now is doing is dropping some mercury into the sluice pan, and carefully with his finger, he's massaging it to form an amalgam. And in the end, you get this gold. You can see a bit of gold there, and you can see a bit of silvery mercury there. So you get this gold mercury amalgam, and that's what you want. You get gold. But you don't want the mercury. So how do you get rid of the mercury? Well, you burn it off. You burn it off right there. And in doing so, you're liberating a lot of mercury into your work environment. You're liberating a lot of mercury into the community and into the regional systems. And you're using a lot of mercury. So look at your palm and imagine that you have a ball of mercury that large in your palm. And imagine that you burn that off every single day. Now imagine you are in the ASGM sector where there are 10 million other people like you doing this every single day. That's a lot of mercury that's being sort of pushed out into the air. And that's what drew me there. So as a mercury environmental toxicologist, that's what drew me there. So initially, this is about 10 years ago now or so, we did our first exposure assessment study in this particular mining community. The data are expressed on sort of aggregate levels, and we all have mercury in our bodies. I can guarantee you that you give me a urine sample, I'll find 1 part per billion of mercury in there. So we're down here. The people that live in these communities, they have mercury in them too, but they have mercury levels in them that are orders of magnitude higher than we have in us. And this is not really that surprising, but the levels are amongst the highest in the world. So as with any research project, it's important to go back to the communities and to share the results. And a few months later I did. And here I'm speaking with Wilson, who's from the Minerals Commission, the government nearby, to sort of understand the results. And the conversation I had with him is one that I'll never forget. From my perspective, I was returning results to community members with grim levels of mercury in them, potentially concerning levels of mercury in them, but very few people cared. And in speaking with Wilson halfway through my day, the conversation went like this. I'm thinking of mercury. And Wilson carefully reminded me that people are thinking that the mercury through the mining is bringing roads into the villages in a way that we never had before. It's connecting us. That the mercury is enabling people to double their daily incomes from $3 a day to $6 a day. That the mercury is bringing better quality food onto the table. And these things sort of all made sense to me. What didn't really make sense to me are those little stars there. People viewed mercury as magic. That here you have an element that for centuries has brought tremendous wealth to communities, helped pull us out of poverty, that it's a source of life, that they revere it so much, they view it in mystical ways, that when you build a house, you impregnate the foundation with mercury in it, okay? And this has been thought of for centuries and centuries. So how am I going to convince people that mercury is bad? So this is sort of the moment that things changed. That up until that point, I was relatively new in my career there, that I was trained to think that you do research as a researcher and you take your discipline and you sort of solve a problem. It takes time and money. You use a method and you plan and you do this to understand. But clearly this is not the way that I needed to proceed. That I need to be more pluralistic in my thinking and ways of doing things. So I'm seeing mercury in a certain way, but these community members are seeing mercury in a very, very different way. And it was from that point where sort of the moment that everything changed, that until that point I was sort of sitting in my toxicology echo chamber, viewing the world a certain way, that I really started to view things very, very differently and started to take a number of changes in how I embarked upon my research activities. Since then, I tend to study mercury in all these different forms. All of these aspects have tremendous benefits for society and for public health, yet they all contain mercury and or are confounded by mercury. So balancing the risks and benefits of mercury in society is sort of what drives my research agenda. And for a number of years, I've really enjoyed doing global health, and we situate our projects all around the world. But motivated by that early experience in Ghana with Wilson in that discussion, most of my projects sort of bring together social scientists, natural scientists, and environmental scientists together. So then going back to the ASGM situation, back then we received some money to do what's called an integrated assessment. So a way to bring together different people and different perspectives. And with this, a plan was set. A plan was set in that we're bringing together people from different disciplines, that we're bringing together experts in country with experts outside of country, and we're going to work carefully with them to set up a plan. This is not going to be a one-off meeting that has no future. Rather, we're going to work very closely with this team, get people to buy in and invest to it, invest their time, their attention to it, and commit to it. And we work in disciplinary groups. Sometimes we break out and work in interdisciplinary groups. We come back to disciplinary groups. There were a number of clear milestones set throughout the project. The outcomes and the outputs were clearly laid at the beginning to incentivize people. There are publications that are going to come from this. There's going to be spin-off research activities. There's going to be a way to link with stakeholders to actually try and make an impact. So that was the goal with this project. What we now had was myself as a trained environmental toxicologist sitting around a table with natural scientists and social scientists, with epidemiologists, with experts in infectious diseases, with physicians who study occupational health. With this group now, we can now go back to the community and we can revisit some of the pictures I showed earlier. So whereas I saw a region with a relatively slow pace, others saw rapid changes. The ecologists noted that there was rapid deforestation going on and that climate change was real up here and that climate change was having an impact on the natural systems that encompass this area. The epidemiologists noticed an agrarian society with people moving around with their cattle, effectively communicating from village to village. They also noticed that everyone has a cell phone, and the way that communities now come together is very different and is rapidly changing. The social scientists noticed that rig back there. We're talking about small-scale gold mining. There's not supposed to be rigs in small-scale gold mining. So what's going on here is that because of land tenure issues, Ghanaians own the land. tribal, there's feudal issues here. But what's happened in this case is that the owner of the mine has now contracted out to a Chinese organization to come and bring in heavy machinery to start doing medium-scale mining. But that Chinese organization to be set up here has an address in Vancouver, Canada. So this is globalization. This is the type of stuff that's going on in these far-off remote communities. And these are perspectives that I did not see as an environmental toxicologist. So whereas here I see a lot of backbreaking labor, the physicians notice that it's just not the backbreaking labor and the use of mercury, but there's a lot of dust in the air there, and that there are babies everywhere, and that it's really, really noisy. The epidemiologists noted that there's about 1,000 people living in the small little community, and there might be 800 huts. You can see one hut here and one hut next door. Everyone has a hut, and everyone has a mining operation in their own hut. They then mapped out the community to give us a better sense of who's doing what and where and how are they connected. And then the social scientists noted that this community was called Kajetia to reflect the name of one of the largest markets in southern Ghana. Okay, the mine nearby they called World Bank. So I think you see the point here that people have dreams and that people name their mines as sort of a reflection of where they want to go. So whereas here I saw puddles of water with toxic chemicals in them, the ecologists noticed that the land is scarred everywhere, that there's tremendous land degradation, and this is changing the environments. The epidemiologists noted that there are all these puddles of water, and especially the entomologist in the team was looking for anopheles this and anopheles that, thinking they could identify all the little critters and bugs, getting very excited about that. Then the social scientists noted, wait, you guys are looking at water as death, but I look at water as life. And what the social scientists were able to do, the anthropologists in this case, was to talk to this lady and all the other women there that made water a livelihood, that they were collecting water here to bathe, to cook, to launder, to make some income, to support the community. The women are vitally important in these communities for many, many reasons, and for them, water was life. So here we have different disciplines looking at water from the death perspective all the way from the life perspective. So then back in our meeting room, my views on ASGM from just a mercury perspective started to change quite rapidly, that all the other disciplines were in the room now, and they're bringing many other perspectives to the table. So by doing so, we get a more divergent view of the situation. So here we have two schematics that came from the project, one on occupational health hazards and one on community health hazards. And from my perspective coming into this, mercury was an issue, but in speaking with a number of other people on the team, there clearly are a number of other hazards that need to be looked at. So we're able to get a more sort of holistic and divergent perspective on how does mercury interact with different pathogens in stress, in silica dust exposure, and noise exposure, so on and so forth. To get a more divergent perspective, but also at a very different level, we're able to get a more holistic perspective that we're able to then use to get a more convergent perspective, that we have mining going on. What's driving this? What are some of the factors globally, both directly and indirectly, that are driving this? What's driving this from a demographic perspective or an economic perspective or socio-political perspective? How does this sort of manifest itself in the communities in terms of land use changes and technology rapidly changing, and sort of the influx of Chinese heavy machinery? How are the ecosystem services being impacted? And ultimately, how does all of this coalesce together to impact human health? It's not just mercury. Mercury is one very small, little, yet important piece of the discussion, but there are so many other drivers that exist at so many other scales that need to be brought to bear. So my thoughts continued to evolve, that I started to realize that you bring together multiple researchers, but it's not the multiple researchers as individuals, rather it's a team. The team is the most important aspect, I feel, in doing this type of work. It's the conversations and the camaraderie that you have with this team that I enjoy the most. My recollections on my relatively recent research career has always been looking back on those conversations we have on 20-hour bus rides, or being holed up in a cabin in the middle of nowhere for days and days and days. The time to have those conversations, the time to sort of develop friendships, is critical. And I would also say that it's not for everyone, and that's perfectly fine. I think it's important for people to gain some deep disciplinary strengths, but there are also there's also a need for different disciplines to come together. And I would say that it's not for everyone. And also, to be frank, I don't think we always want to bring in the strongest and smartest researchers into our team. Thinking about the individual and what they bring to the table and can they work in a team environment is just as important, if not more important, than the quality of that individual in terms of their scientific thought. It's important to bring together multiple disciplines. So I started to realize that we need to be able to look at these grand issues from a natural sciences perspective, from a medical perspective, and from a social sciences perspective. That by doing so, we can look collaboratively at these grand challenges and do so at a more grander level. It takes time. It takes time to build trust. It takes time to sort of understand one another and sort of get over these linguistic barriers that tend to sort of isolate one another. Money is key. And when we look at the different methods that each of us use in our scientific disciplines, it's important to sort of focus in on the core methods and explain those core methods to others, but also look at the frontiers and the interfaces. What are those methods that sort of work sort of well in the natural sciences that can be ported to the social sciences, and with a bit of discussion, we can improve the methods overall. I would say that very few of us are trained to adequately run scientific research projects. We don't have the management. We don't have the management training that's required. So it's important to then go off and hire professionals to help us plan meetings, to manage the projects, to do project evaluations. And in doing all this, I think we can get a more holistic and a more deeper understanding of whatever challenges we face. But how do we then take this wide interdisciplinary knowledge and go off and make an impact, really start to translate this knowing into making a difference? So this is a quote that was brought to my attention a few years ago, which I really, really like. And this is a solution. So when we went to one of our mining sites, you see placards like this over there, but in the end, very few people are going to be reading them. And again, we're talking about a chemical that people view through mystical lenses that they impregnate their foundations with. So I don't think the sign really, really works. We sometimes see people handing out masks in these communities to limit their people's exposures to mercury, but masks are difficult. They don't often, they're not often used properly. They may not be the right mask, and also when the temperature is so hot, who's going to wear a mask? It doesn't seem like the proper solution. Retorts have sort of come into fashion that to contain the mercury, you do the amalgamation in this glass jar. But there are two issues here. One is that for centuries, people have been doing amalgamation and mining and smelting in a very certain way that relies upon tactile senses. It's in a jar now. You don't feel it anymore. People feel like they're getting ripped off. The second thing is that this is glass. Glass breaks. This thing costs about a month's salary. Who's going to replace it when it breaks? So all of these solutions have good intentions. They're the ones that we sort of discuss and hear of in our field, but they're not really grounded in evidence, nor are they really bringing together the right people. So you may have well-intentioned NGOs carrying around bags of masks, but they're not talking to the physician and the occupational experts to sort of really understand how difficult it is to promote and use a mask properly. You may have engineers that come up with a magical solution here with retorts, which would work under careful laboratory conditions, but they're not talking to the social scientists to understand how people will actually perceive and use this. In the end, these ideas are becoming futile. So how do we actually come up with solutions that are based on evidence? How do we come up with solutions that are based on different disciplinary perspectives and are really adopted and taken up by the communities? So up until this point, we've been doing research at this site from a researcher perspective. So a number of scientists looking at a lot of data, generating the outputs that would be expected in our academic and research settings. And then through the project, we realized that we needed to start to transition quick to bring the stakeholders into this. So we got more stakeholders involved in the project than researchers. These stakeholders represented key institutions across the country. They involved high-level people in a number of organizations, including people that worked at the level of the deputy ministers. And they started to come into our meetings as well now, too. So at this point, we were able to develop a relatively large evidence base based on scientific evidence from social, natural, environmental perspectives. But how do we now start to shift the focus to the stakeholders. So what we started to do is to work with them to sort of look at the evidence and to identify options. And I just wanted to sort of provide to you one particular activity we did. It's called a Delphi poll. It's an iterative method of sort of trawling options and opinions from stakeholders. It's done in an iterative way, meaning that we sort of do a survey, we reflect upon it, we do it again, reflect upon it. Each time you iterate upon it, you go deeper and deeper and deeper. We do it in a group setting like we would do around the table here, but we also do it in a private setting because we also know that many people have a lot of important things to say, but sometimes the most quieted voices are the ones that are not heard in these settings. So it's important to find ways to get those people to speak up, and we felt that doing this through private settings like through internet polling would work well too. Again, this is where we start to transition to the stakeholders. So this whole activity was facilitated by the government's Science and Policy Research Institute. So in the end, we wanted to come up with solutions that were viewed globally. So in the end, we want solutions that make an impact, but we also want solutions that are feasible. But it's a bit more nuanced than impact and feasibility. Impact can be looked at economic impact or environmental impact or social impact, and these may not be compatible. Feasibility can be broken down equally into an economic cost feasibility. Is it going to be socially accepted? Is there political will? Is there logistical feasibility to do this? So working within the team, we were then able to break our poll up into these dimensions and ask questions on potential options, on whether it has an impact and if it's feasible, and go even deeper that is there an economic impact that can be sort of compared against social feasibility. And this is the type of data we get from it. It's way more nuanced, and I won't go into it too much except just give you one example. So as an environmental toxicologist, we're trying to promote to do this using mercury-free methods. There are ways to do so, and if they could be implemented, they would have high benefit to people and the environment. So if we asked the survey question in a certain way, this would rank really, really high. But when we start to also ask about the feasibility, we learn very quickly from the stakeholders, again, people on the ground who know the situation much better than we do as researchers, that there's a low chance this could be implemented, and there's low economic feasibility here. So we were able to move the project from research to stakeholders to action, and we were fortuitous in a sense that the stakeholders really grabbed onto this. We're having a discussion there on the top left with the Minister of the Environment, and it's that ministry and the Ministry of Health that really started to take this on. And it worked quite well in that at this time, the government was coming up with a national sort of reformulation of their laws concerning ASGM. And also on a global scale, the Minamata Convention is here. And for those of us that study mercury pollution, this has been a wonderful opportunity to sort of take the science that we've been doing for many, many years and learn how to now take the science to help inform and prop up global policy. So the Minamata Convention is here. And when you look at a chemicals management convention, I think Minamata is unique. Just take a glance at some of the words here. A lot of these words are words that you would tend to find in a more public health discussion, in a more holistic discussion that looked at sustainability, building capacity and educating. These are not terms we find in other conventions out there. So I think the folks that put the Minamata Convention together were quite clever in terms of bringing together ways of thinking that span disciplines and span sectors as well there too. So this is sort of unfolding right now globally, and ASGM comprises a major component of it. Okay, so my thoughts continue to evolve. I started to realize at this phase that the team needed to include blue chip partners to really move the research into action. We needed to include partners that sort of sat at the highest offices that could really take the evidence base and act upon it. I started to realize that we needed to move beyond researchers and the disciplines they represent, but also bring in the different sectors, that we needed to bring in the government sector, we needed to bring in the NGO sector, we needed to bring in other sectors. We needed to not just look at problems, but also come up with solutions. Working with the same group for many, many years builds trust. It gives you the flexibility and the power to go to the next level. Money is always key and more is better. The toolkits that we can use can ever expand, and we can innovate because science is moving ever so quickly that we can then pull from our individual disciplinary innovations and find ways to bring them together. We can take this understanding to synthesize, but really I've left at a point here in this project is how do you sustain this? Up until now, it's been researchers coming from the global north, going to West Africa, sort of catalyzing some work, getting some handoffs to the local community there, the local country and the officials. But how do we help them sustain this work so that in country themselves, they have the capacity and the resources to go to the next level? So I want to briefly touch upon the GEOHealth program. There are a few of you here that have familiarity with this. This is a program that is led by Fogarty and IDRC in Canada to build global capacity around the world in terms of environmental and occupational health. So it's to support the development of institutions and LMICs to serve as regional hubs for research so that they lead the research, to do the research training in country, where we've always enjoyed having students from other countries come to our universities, but how do we promote them to stay in country, to get degrees from their own institutions, to strengthen their own institutions? How do we get in-country researchers to manage their own data? We live in an era of big data. How do we set up big data infrastructures in country? How do we set up academic programs that are just as robust and strong as the ones that we have here in the country? And then how do we take all this knowledge that's generated in country and translate it for the countries and the researchers in countries to sort of address their own local, regional, and international issues? So ultimately, how do we build capacity and sustainability? So for us in West Africa, we were lucky that I've explained to you the ASGM team project, but there were a number of other projects we were involved with, including an IDRC EcoHealth chair focused on air pollution that we were able to use through the GEOHealth program to lasso together and come up with this GEOHealth network that's based out of the University of Ghana. This is the leader of the network, Julius Fobel. He's a chair of environmental health at the University of Ghana. And this is the study site that we decided to focus in on. It's the Agbogbloshie e-waste site. It's one of the largest e-waste sites in the world. And we felt that it was at this e-waste site that we can now sort of start to flip the way that we do research. We could still do a number of innovative disciplinary research activities and questions. It would be done in country at the site, but led by the country, led by country researchers, led by students from West African institutions that are doing the work. So I'm running out of time, so I'll speed through this. So the way that the project is set up, like some of the other GEOHealth programs that exist in this room here, is that the funding comes now to the experts in country. It's not necessarily flowing as heavily as it did to the North American Global North Institutes, but it goes mainly in country. And the in-country researchers now use that to sort of set up their research infrastructure. Here they're linking with international groups on the upper right, which is important. So we're starting to see, at least in our particular case, that things are sort of moving in the direction that we want. Research results are being shared with the communities. They're also being shared with stakeholders. But I think to really start to sustain this, we need to go to the next levels here. How do we bring in the stakeholders, whether it is the ministers of health and the environment, and also international bodies? How do we bring them into the research program? How do we sort of envelop them into our own program? And same with the community. How do we get the community more invested in our program? So this hasn't quite been realized in our project. This is where we're going now. But I can tell you from other projects I've been involved with, to get stakeholders more invested in the project, we need to find ways for them to invest in the project. As an aside, for a chemicals management program that I run, we need our stakeholders to put upwards of 40% of the project funding in place. We're talking about millions and millions of dollars that they're putting into our project. That brings them to the table. That brings them to the forefront of all discussions. For communities, the work that we do in the Arctic, all projects being done in the Arctic and Canada are decided upon by community members. They drive the research agenda in the Canadian Arctic. So there's some examples we can draw on from elsewhere that help us to better make this sustainable and lasting. So then, in terms of my final thoughts, in terms of doing work, in terms of getting at this interplay across disciplines between researchers and stakeholders, the team is important. Researchers, stakeholders coming together, that's important. Once you sort of build up that research team, they're shovel ready. They can sort of take on other grand challenges. They can take on disasters as they emerge. The team has to be disciplinary. I think the role of the social scientist is one that is underappreciated and much needed. In a group like this, and like with many of the meetings that we go to, there are a lot of environmental scientists here and a lot of biomedical experts, and we connect them together, and we're struggling. What about that social sciences perspective? When we look at the grand challenges in pollution and infectious diseases, these are ones that touch upon human rights. They're ones that touch upon economic and security issues. And I would say for all the topics I've discussed right now, these have only gone to the next level because of the social scientists. They personally, myself, gave me a real awakening in the ASGM site. If we look at the way that we discuss chemicals management and indigenous issues, for example, these are human rights issues more than anything, but we don't talk about it enough as a human rights issue. There are also economic issues that should be brought into the discussions. I think the social scientists aspect is critical. I think to make a difference, we need to focus on problems that are driven by stakeholders, because in the end, they're the ones that can then take the research findings and act upon it. We're not talking about passive handovers, but really active engagement of the stakeholders. I think the time aspect I've touched on a few times is an investment. There are a number of platforms that have been built around the world. NIH, CIHR in Canada have been doing this for a long, long time. So we need to sort of view those investments in a different way and ensure that we continue to invest in them. Money is key. Getting the partners to invest is key as well too. The scientific toolkit is ever expanding. It needs to be fit for purpose for whatever questions you have. And as I've alluded to earlier, that there's so much innovation in each of our fields that we need to find ways to share these innovative methods, but also look at ways to interface and work at the frontiers. As I alluded to earlier, management is key. It improves the scientific outputs and the quality of the work. And the last thing I wanted to really mention on this slide is design thinking. This is sort of in vogue for me right now, is that how do we actually embrace a design thinking philosophy in our work? That how do we empathize with users? How do we empathize with community members? How do we empathize with regulators? And with them, how do we define the issues? How do we then brainstorm and ideate with them? And how do we test our ideas with them and then iterate upon this? So it's a continuous feedback loop mechanism of a way of sort of bringing together different groups. We need to do this because we face grand challenges. I think all of you are familiar with these types of global burden of diseases charts. They're ones that are sort of rife with environmental issues, infectious diseases, pollution. But when we look at our scholarly works, we're not connecting. So I did this back of the envelope calculation just a few days ago. PubMed search the last 10 years of the term environmental health, 40,000 articles. Infectious diseases, 53,000 articles. We're generating a lot of information. Put these two together, maybe 40, in a good year, 50 articles together. Many of those articles are written by people in this room who spoke yesterday. So we're really not connecting. So thanks to the teams and funders that I reflected upon today. And if you have questions, I'll be here today and you can email me there. Thanks.